Good evening, wanderer of midnight minds. You've found your way back again, haven't you? Perhaps you couldn't sleep because the modern world smells too sterile, too neatly wrapped in peppermint soap and quiet antiseptics. Or maybe, like me, you are haunted by the stink of forgotten centuries. A different kind of perfume, earthier, rancid, alive in a way that makes your skin crawl. Welcome back, my dear listener, to the dark corners of history they never tell you about in class. Tonight, I invite you to slide under your blanket and drift slowly, reluctantly, into the grimy sheets of time. We are going back, far back, back to the filthy folds of 9th century England. Back to a man whose skin was considered sacred, whose sweat was a holy scent, at least to those who feared his sword more than his stench. King Edward the Elder, son of Alfred the Great, father of a united England. They wrote songs of his battles. They chanted his name in candlelit monasteries. But no one ever sings about his bathwater, because there wasn't any. Not the way you think of it. Because while his legacy smells like parchment and power, the man himself likely reeked of rancid mutton grease, festering foot rot, and the breathless fermentation of royal undergarments worn far too long beneath chainmail and sanctimony. Tonight, we open a creaking door into Edward's private chambers, not his war room, not his council halls, but the most intimate of places, his body, his skin, his teeth, his bowels, his lice, his sweat, his filth. Because history, when scrubbed clean, tells only half the story. And here, dear listener, we do not sanitize. We do not flinch. We do not worship the crown without sniffing the scalp beneath it. So close your eyes. Inhale. Hold it. Now imagine you're in the middle of Wessex, the royal seat of a kingdom not yet called England. The hearth smolders. The floor is dirt-packed with ash and rat droppings. And somewhere above it all, wrapped in layers of wool, linen, animal fur, and pride, there sits a king. A man of iron will and iron odor. He is Edward. He is elder, and he is dirty. God, he is so dirty. Let's not begin with battle. That's far too noble. Let's begin instead with his armpits. Imagine a woolen tunic, worn for days, no weeks. A kind of fabric that soaks up sweat, but never releases it. Edward's underarms were likely damp most hours of the day, even in winter. Why? Because even a king can't escape the physics of flesh. A man who marched with troops, hunted boar on horseback, and argued with clerics in overheated halls was a man who perspired. And while he may have had servants to wipe his brow, no one was wiping the swamp of grime pooling beneath his arms. That was his kingdom alone. A private dominion of bacteria, body odor, and old dried blood from hunting wounds. And his beard, the beard. Portraits of him are few, but we can guess. He was a king of war, not of powdered wigs. His beard would have been thick, unruly, more animal than ornament. And in it, nestled between crumbs of dried bread and coagulated broth, likely danced tiny invaders' lice, fleas, and the occasional errant flea egg clinging like treasure to a pirate's hold. It was not just decoration. It was an ecosystem. But if you think the face was foul, you haven't met his mouth. The teeth of a 9th century monarch were not the white stones of Hollywood imagination. They were more like old gravestones, crooked, yellow, sometimes cracked, sometimes missing altogether. Toothbrushes? Not yet. Toothpaste? A fantasy. Mouthwash. Wine, maybe. Mead, if he was feeling indulgent. The breath of King Edward likely smelled of old onions, sour milk, and something far darker, something that only rot can explain. And yet, he would have spoken with authority. He would have kissed wives. He would have shouted orders. All while that scent curled from his lips like a ghost no priest could exorcise. And then his hands. Oh, the royal hands that signed charters, grasped swords, and perhaps clutched at a lover's thigh in the darkness. Those hands were tools, yes, but they were also traps. Under the fingernails of a Saxon king was a time capsule of disease. Soil from battlefield graves, pus from wounded comrades, animal feces from ill-aimed horses. He did not wash them before eating. He did not wash them before prayer. He simply wiped them on the nearest cloth, or his cloak, or nothing at all. It is possible, even likely, that King Edward touched the same bread he ate after slitting a man's throat or gutting a pig, and no one stopped him. He was the king, after all. Who would dare tell him to clean his nails? Now, dear listener, you might be wondering, did he ever bathe? Did Edward ever sink his royal body into a bath of warm water and scrub away the layers of kingly crust? Yes and no. Bathing in Saxon England was not entirely unknown, but it was rare. And when it did happen, it was ceremonial, almost suspicious. There was a belief, whispered in the monastic shadows, that too much bathing could weaken the soul, open the pores, let the demons in. And so, Edward bathed when it suited the performance of purity, not the practice of it. A ritual bath for coronation, perhaps. A rinse before bedding a noble woman. But a regular, thorough, scrub behind the ears kind of bath? Unlikely. If he did, it was in cold water and quickly. No soap, no sponge, no scented oils. Just water, cloth, and perhaps a prayer to St. Cuthbert. But there's more. So much more. You see, this was a man who wore his armor like a second skin, and that skin was suffocating. Beneath chainmail and leather, Edward's body stewed, his back chafed by days of riding, his feet swollen from boots that never truly fit, his groin, oh God, his groin likely a petri dish of fungal indignity. A battlefield king does not carry talcum powder in his saddlebag. He carries sweat and pain and blisters that ooze. The stench followed him. It preceded him. It lingered long after he left a room. And yet, he was revered, adored, because power, my friend, has a smell of its own. And sometimes, it's worse than death. So why are we here? Why speak of this now? Because history deserves its truth. Not just the victories, but the viscera. Not just the names etched in stone, but the sweat soaked into the linen. And because Edward the Elder, like so many kings, was more beast than myth. A man of blood and grime. A creature of habit, flesh, and holy rot. You deserve to meet him not in golden light, but in the half-dark of his tent, where his boots steamed with mildew and his cloak smelled of horse piss. You deserve the full scent of sovereignty. So lie back, close your eyes. Take one last clean breath. We begin now. The king has entered the room. There is a kind of loneliness that only kings can afford. It festers in the folds of robes worn too long, in the silence of stone-walled chambers that trap the odor of wet wool and breathless paranoia. Edward, the Elder, bore such loneliness not in his heart, but on his skin. A skin that never fully breathed, wrapped as it was in fabric, armor, and expectation. Not once did he wake to the luxury of clean linen sheets. Not once did he smell jasmine in his quarters, unless it was smuggled in by some foreign ambassador who didn't know any better. What he knew, what he breathed, what soaked into the pores of his existence, was the essence of human persistence, the raw, unfiltered scent of survival without soap. You might picture him reading Psalms by firelight, and maybe he did. But do not imagine the soft warmth of comfort there. Imagine instead the flickering light catching the greasy sheen on his forehead, the smoke of the tallow candle rising not as purity, but as a veil, masking something far more pungent. The smell of a man who hadn't bathed since the last full moon. A man whose scalp itched constantly beneath the stiff dome of a crown that never quite fit his head, not because of its size, but because it was never designed for someone who still smelled like a pigsty during council meetings. You want to know him, do you? You want to step through the pages of chronicle and myth to see the man behind the title? Then start with his chamber pot. Yes, let's begin there. Buried beneath a fur-lined bed, not 6 feet from where he laid his weary body each night, was a ceramic vessel cracked at the rim, yellowed at the lip, and filled daily with the royal excretions of digestion and dread. It is said that Edward had a strong stomach. What they don't to say is how often that stomach groaned after meals of half-cooked venison or bread laced with mold, too faint to see, but too stubborn to ignore. His bowels were not immune to the hygiene of his cooks, who stirred pottage with fingers scratched by rats. And so his body rebelled quietly, violently, and often. Imagine a night where the wind howled outside the wooden shutters, and inside the king groaned not from nightmares, but from the war within his intestines. There was no privacy, no toilet flusher to drown the noise. Only the squelch of urgency into a pot that steamed faintly in the cold air, mingling with the scents of sweat, leather, and the stale perfume of cloaks too proud to be washed. And then there were his feet. Ah, his feet, carriers of empire, ground down by the weight of rule and chainmail. Edward's boots were not custom-fitted. They were stiff, stitched by hands that could not imagine the agony of a monarch's march across wet fields. Inside those boots, a kingdom festered. Toenails blackened by fungus, soles blistered and burst open beneath layers of grime, heels cracked like dry earth in midsummer. He wore woolen socks when he could, but wool, once wet, remembers. It traps every step in a damp recollection of pain. When he walked, it was not regal. It was calculated, like a man balancing atop invisible blades. And yet, none dared comment on the smell that rose from his boots when he removed them. None dared wrinkle a nose when the royal feet were bared to servants whose faces learned to freeze in reverence, not revulsion. But freeze they did, because that odor-rich, ripe, unrelenting was not one you could forget. It lingered long after the king left the room, like an omen or a curse. And still, the church praised his virtue. Isn't it strange how holiness often smells like decay in the stories we ignore? Edward was no exception. His court chroniclers were men of ink and faith, not of nose and honesty. They recorded his victories, his sons, his piety. But not once did they mention the sores beneath his thighs from riding too long, the chafed rawness of skin where sweat met saddle, the ulcers that festered quietly beneath layers of garments too noble to lift. No one wrote of the suppurating wound on his right side, perhaps from a boil, or maybe from a battle blade that had healed too slowly and reopened too often. It wept beneath his tunic, not enough to kill him, just enough to remind him of what? Of being human, perhaps. Of being mortal in a role that demanded the illusion of divinity. And so he endured it, this quiet seeping agony like so many others, in silence. Only his physician knew. A man whose own hands likely hadn't seen water in days. The cure? A poultice made of goose fat, honey, and crushed herbs applied with linen reused from the last patient, a soldier with gangrene. And thus the rot perpetuated itself, cycle upon cycle, flesh to cloth to flesh again, and still Edward ruled. But we haven't yet spoken of his hair. Not the beard, no. We've plucked that corpse already, but the scalp, the place where dreams sleep and lice feast. His hair was long, because kings do not cut for fashion. It was knotted at the nape, not by design, but by neglect. Combing was rare, and when it happened, it drew blood. The scalp itched constantly, even in sleep. And no matter how many times he scratched, the itch always returned. The lice were never truly gone. They lived in his furs, in his pillows, in the very creases of his ceremonial crown. And they loved him, because he never burned his clothes, because washing meant risk, because his courtiers whispered that soap was a temptation of vanity. So the lice multiplied, and with them came the whispers of divine punishment, a holy affliction, the monks might say, proof of God's test. But God wasn't the one scratching behind his ears until they bled. Edward did that himself, alone, in the dark, with fingers he never washed. And yet he touched everything. Scrolls, crosses, his children's heads, the hilts of swords that would decide the fate of men who would never know how deeply their king stank. How many decrees did he sign with hands crusted in yesterday's oil, and the faint smear of blood from a nosebleed he didn't bother to wipe? How many churches were consecrated by lips that had kissed a woman hours earlier and had not tasted water since? And still he was revered, because filth does not disqualify power. In fact, sometimes it sanctifies it. In a world without soap, the dirtiest man could still be the holiest, if his enemies died in droves and his sons sat obediently at his feet. And his enemies did die. Oh yes, Edward was ruthless, not just in battle, but in law. Thieves had their hands removed. Adulterers were whipped publicly. But never once did he enforce a rule about public hygiene, because none would follow it, because all were guilty, because even the bishop who raised the Eucharist had dung on his sandals and sweat beneath his robes. They were all unclean, and in their collective filth they found unity, brotherhood, even God, the same God who watched over Edward as he rubbed his growing raw from the itching and dared not ask why. Because questions were for the weak, for the washed. And he, Edward the Elder, was neither. His bed, too, bore witness. A simple structure, though decorated, furs for warmth, straw beneath. And beneath the straw, old stains. Some from wine, some from blood, most from fluids better left unnamed. He did not sleep alone. Kings rarely do. But his bedfellow, whether wife or concubine, entered not a palace, but a den. They lay beside a man who had not scrubbed his back since childhood, whose breath could wilt parsley, whose groin carried more secrets than state documents. And yet they endured, perhaps even adored. Because power, dear listener, is an aphrodisiac far more potent than rosewater, and Edward had it in abundance. He also had parasites. Inside him, worms, most likely. They were common then, passed from undercooked meat or contaminated grain. His belly swelled sometimes, and not from feasting. His appetite wavered, as did his bowels. No one suspected, or they pretended not to, because kings were not dissected in life. Their pain was sacred, and silent, and camouflaged beneath embroidered cloaks that smelled faintly of urine. You think I'm joking. I am not. Nighttime relief did not always reach the pot, and even kings misjudged their bladders, especially after wine, especially in winter, when rising from bed meant frostbite. So he let go, quietly, and let it dry. And when dawn came, they called him majestic. Now tell me, what is majesty, if not a crown placed on a man who reeks of the battlefield even in his sleep? We will never know the full scent of King Edward, but we can guess. We can trace it in the patterns of his silence. The way no one stood too close for too long. The way his servants rotated shifts so frequently, you'd think they were soldiers, not chamberlains. The way his dog's faithful, drooling beasts sometimes whined when he entered the room. They knew. Dogs always know, but they licked his hand anyway. And maybe that's the moral here, that even in the filth, there is loyalty. Even in the rot, there is reverence. That power, for all its putrescence, commands a kind of worship that perfume cannot mimic. And Edward knew this. He bathed in loyalty, not water. He was washed not by soap, but by history's selective memory. And tonight, we peel back that memory. We let the smell rise. We do not flinch. Because to know a man, truly, deeply, irrevocably, you must start with what he tried to hide. And Edward hid everything, except his odor. That he carried like a crown. And if his crown carried the weight of kingdoms, his undergarments carried the weight of days sodden, silent, reeking of every bodily function that no scribe dared record. There's something brutally honest about a pair of linen bras worn too long. They do not lie. They do not flatter. They hold memory in creases that no historian opens. And Edward, like all rulers, wore them until they stiffened with use, until they could almost stand on their own. They were the fabric of reality beneath the fabric of ceremony. And when he disrobed, if ever he did alone, the air must have recoiled before the man even moved. For no flesh encased in wool and sweat and secrecy can emerge unscathed. There were stories whispered in back halls that the king refused to change them more than once a month during campaign season, not out of pride, but efficiency. And that, in some twisted logic, makes sense. When your enemies want your head, who has time for hygiene? When every castle wall might collapse, would you not trade soap for steel? Yet no amount of war justifies what festered beneath that beltline. Fungal bloom, patches of skin that peeled without warning, a rash so permanent it was mistaken for a birthmark by his mistresses, and none of them said a word. Because love, in that age, was not always a choice. It was a duty soaked in silence, performed in shadow, and endured with a tolerance that only history can admire without understanding. And what of his meals? The feasts they imagined turkey legs, dripping fat, goblets of wine, or half-truths. Yes, he feasted, but not with clean hands, not on sterilized surfaces. His trencher, a slab of old bread that soaked the juices of meat, was reused so many times that it sometimes turned green before the dogs got it. Meat was oversalted, wine was soured, and the grease that dripped down his beard rarely came from choice cuts. He chewed with molars darkened by neglect, swallowed past a throat often inflamed, and digested through a gut battling parasites, half-rotted grain, and the perpetual ache of medieval nutrition. It was not royal dining. It was survival at the table, masked by trumpets. And still he fasted, on command, for the church, for Lent, for the sins of his people. But do not mistake fasting for cleansing. It was spiritual self-denial, atop physical self-abandonment. He starved his stomach, but fed the worms inside it. And when he broke fast, it was with a hunger so desperate, so primal, that decorum vanished. He tore bread like a wolf. He gnawed bones. He drooled. And if his servants caught the spit mid-fall with cloth, they never flinched. Because proximity to power requires numbness, especially of the senses. His bedchambers were worse in winter. Cold preserved the stink. Nothing dried. Not the sheets, not the boots, not the walls themselves. Mold grew in corners like prayer candles for forgotten saints. Mice built kingdoms beneath his floorboards, feasting on the crumbs of a king too important to sweep. And above it all, Edward dreamed, not of cleanliness, of conquest, of territory, of holding together a land splintering beneath the weight of its own filth. A metaphor, maybe. A kingdom kept together by a man unraveling. And there were children, many, born of wives, lovers, arrangements that history cannot untangle. Some loved him, some feared him. All knew the smell. It was the smell of fatherhood. Not tobacco, or ink or cologne, but of manhood unwashed, breath thick with morning rot, and fingers that lingered too long on a cheek, not out of tenderness, but confusion. Kings are not trained in gentleness. They inherit power before they inherit empathy. And Edward, born to rule, never learned softness. Only command. Even in affection, there was something rigid, something that smelled like iron and old milk. The churchmen praised his piety. They did not praise his hygiene. They couldn't, because even they, draped in cassocks, were rank beneath the cloth. Holiness did not come with fragrance. Incense was burned not for ritual, but for masking. The church reeked of bodies, of confession, of incense thick enough to choke. Edward knelt there often, Not because he loved God, but because even he needed somewhere to hide from his own stench. And in the church, everyone stank the same. Equality, in the end, was odor. And when he traveled, it was worse. Roads were not roads, but wounds on the landscape. He rode through mud so deep, it remembered your horse's name. He slept in beds infested with fleas, in halls that hadn't been aired since the last funeral. And wherever he went, he left behind more than law. He left his scent, embedded in the tapestries, in the pillows, in the women, in the very wood grain of thrones. Some claimed they could still smell him years later, as if his body refused to be forgotten. But he would be forgotten, not the name, not the deeds, but the man, the skin, the filth, the rot. And that, perhaps, is why we tell it now, so that you remember. Not just Edward the Elder, but the cost of command when water is a luxury and honesty a crime. And the skin of kings, no matter how divine, still sweats. Now sleep, if you can. His scent is in the room. And if his crown carried the weight of kingdoms, his undergarments carried the weight of days, sodden, silent, reeking of every bodily function that no scribe dared record. There's something brutally honest about a pair of linen bries worn too long. They do not lie. They do not flatter. They hold memory in creases that no historian opens. And Edward, like all rulers, wore them until they stiffened with use, until they could almost stand on their own. They were the fabric of reality beneath the fabric of ceremony. And when he disrobed, if ever he did alone, the air must have recoiled before the man even moved. For no flesh encased in wool and sweat and secrecy can emerge unscathed. There were stories whispered in back halls that the king refused to change them more than once a month during campaign season. Not out of pride, but efficiency. And that, in some twisted logic, makes sense. When your enemies want your head, who has time for hygiene? When every castle wall might collapse, would you not trade soap for steel? Yet no amount of war justifies what festered beneath that beltline. Fungal bloom. Patches of skin that peeled without warning. A rash so permanent, it was mistaken for a birthmark by his mistresses. And none of them said a word. Because love, in that age, was not always a choice. It was a duty soaked in silence, performed in shadow, and endured with a tolerance that only history can admire without understanding. And what of his meals? The feasts they imagined turkey legs, dripping fat, goblets of wine, were half-truths. Yes, he feasted, but not with clean hands, not on sterilized surfaces. His trencher, a slab of old bread that soaked the juices of meat, was reused so many times that it sometimes turned green before the dogs got it. Meat was oversalted, wine was soured, and the grease that dripped down his beard rarely came from choice cuts. He chewed with molars darkened by neglect, swallowed past a throat often inflamed, and digested through a gut battling parasites. Half-rotted grain, and the perpetual ache of medieval nutrition. It was not royal dining. It was survival at the table, masked by trumpets. And still he fasted, on command. For the church, for Lent, for the sins of his people. But do not mistake fasting for cleansing. It was spiritual self-denial, atop physical self-abandonment. He starved his stomach, but fed the worms inside it. And when he broke fast, it was with a hunger so desperate, so primal, that decorum vanished. He tore bread like a wolf. He gnawed bones. He drooled. And if his servants caught the spit mid-fall with cloth, they never flinched. Because proximity to power requires numbness, especially of the senses. His bedchambers were worse in winter. Cold preserved the stink. Nothing dried. Not the sheets, not the boots, not the walls themselves. Mold grew in corners, like prayer candles for forgotten saints. Mice built kingdoms beneath his floorboards, feasting on the crumbs of a king too important to sweep. And above it all, Edward dreamed, not of cleanliness, of conquest, of territory. of holding together a land splintering beneath the weight of its own filth. A metaphor, maybe. A kingdom kept together by a man unraveling. And there were children, many, born of wives, lovers, arrangements that history cannot untangle. Some loved him. Some feared him. All knew the smell. It was the smell of fatherhood. Not tobacco or ink or cologne, but of manhood unwashed, breath thick with morning rot, and fingers that lingered too long on a cheek, not out of tenderness, but confusion. Kings are not trained in gentleness. They inherit power before they inherit empathy. And Edward, born to rule, never learned softness, only command. Even in affection, there was something rigid, something that smelled like iron and old milk. The churchmen praised his piety. They did not praise his hygiene. They couldn't, because even they, draped in cassocks, were rank beneath the cloth. Holiness did not come with fragrance. Incense was burned not for ritual, but for masking. The church reeked. Of bodies, of confession, of incense thick enough to choke. Edward knelt there often. Not because he loved God, but because even he needed somewhere to hide from his own stench. And in the church, everyone stank the same. Equality, in the end, was odor. And when he traveled, it was worse. Roads were not roads, but wounds on the landscape. He rode through mud so deep, it remembered your horse's name. He slept in beds infested with fleas, in halls that hadn't been aired since the last funeral. And wherever he went, he left behind more than law. He left his scent, embedded in the tapestries, in the pillows, in the women, in the very wood grain of thrones. Some claimed they could still smell him years later, as if his body refused to be forgotten. But he would be forgotten, not the name, not the deeds, but the man, the skin, the filth, the rot. And that, perhaps, is why we tell it now, so that you remember. Not just Edward the Elder, but the cost of command when water is a luxury and honesty a crime. And the skin of kings, no matter how divine, still sweats. Now sleep, if you can. His scent is in the room, and it clings, not because it wants to, but because it knows no other place to go. Like a ghost too heavy to float, too vile to be welcomed. His scent had gravity. It pulled at fabric, lingered in nostrils long after breath had ceased, nestled itself into the wool of 1,000 standards waved in his honor. There was no separating Edward the Elder from the fog of his own biology. And maybe that is the most royal thing about him. Not his crown, not his command, but his inevitability. He was the mold behind the throne, the pus beneath the parchment, the human in the hymn. And this truth cannot be carved into stone or sung by monks only whispered. Here, when the candles have burned low and your comfort has made you bold enough to hear it. You want more? Then step into the baths he never used. Picture them. Empty, cold, ornamental, built to impress envoys, not to clean flesh. The water within them still stagnant, like his understanding of hygiene. Because in his world, water was for drinking, not for dousing shame. To bathe was to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable was to tempt fate. And so he remained armored even in private, his sweat a shield, his stink a statement. And when his enemies accused him of pride, they never guessed how much of it was hiding rot. But even the strongest rot has its rhythm. His grew in the crooks of his elbows, the valley of his back, the backs of his knees, where breathless heat met indifferent fabric. It was a kingdom of dampness, ruled by a man who thought dryness was a myth. And within that dampness lived not just decay, but dependence. Because once your body becomes a prison, even filth can feel like routine. He scratched not to soothe, but to remember he was real. He bled not from battle, but from habitual abrasion. He coughed not from sickness, but from the dust of himself. And still, he stood before crowds as if carved from oak, stoic, dignified. But trees do not stink. And Edward did, Gloriously, hilariously, tragically. His courtiers learned to breathe shallow, to speak with distance, to bow quickly and step away quicker. They called it protocol. It was survival. His scent taught them the limits of loyalty. They would die for him, but they would not inhale too deeply. And he knew. Oh, he knew. For he had eyes, and he watched their faces contort barely when the wind shifted. He watched them blink too fast, adjust collars, feign coughs, and he smiled. Because if they feared his odor, they feared his truth. And that was power. Real power. The kind you do not wash off. The kind that stains everything it touches. Now sleep, if you can. Because there are 5 more nights in this story. And each one grows darker, damper, closer to the marrow of a man you've only just begun to smell. There is a room in every castle that should never be opened. Not because it holds treasure, but because it remembers too well. Edward had several of these. Chambers where the stone itself held its breath, where the light from the narrow slit windows arrived hesitant and apologetic, and where the tapestries hung not for beauty, but to cover the weeping walls. And still they wept. Condensation was the least of it. These walls remembered skin. They remembered nights where the king paced naked, half mad with fever, bleeding from the thighs, and whispering names no one in court recognized. Names of old ghosts or young girls or saints he never confessed to. These rooms were not royal. They were rotting witnesses. And they smelled like it. The air was thick not just with mold, but with resignation. The kind of heaviness that no incense could cut. And yet he returned to them, night after night, as if shame needed a sanctuary. You'd think a king could choose better. But Edward was never interested in comfort. He sought containment. Places that didn't talk back. Places where even the rats moved slowly, loaded on parchment crumbs and sacramental bread stolen from forgotten altars. And he lived there like a relic that refused to be entombed. In those rooms, he peeled off his garments, not with relief, but with dread, because every layer removed revealed more of a truth even his reflection couldn't tolerate. The truth that beneath the armor, the velvet, the woven power symbols, there was a body that had stopped feeling like his own, covered in bruises of unknown origin, riddled with calluses that cracked open without provocation. One nipple blackened by frostbite from a winter ride where his cloak had torn, another scar bisecting his belly that no healer had dared examine too closely. His body was no longer biography, it was prophecy. It foretold collapse, and no one dared read it aloud. There was a smell that gathered beneath his kneecaps. Not quite rot, not quite earth. More like the musk of confession, left too long unanswered. When he knelt in prayer, it steamed through the folds of his tunic and found its way into the wood of the pews. That's why they burned the benches after his death, you know. Not to honor him, but to cleanse what could not be unsmelled. The wood remembered. It always does. The same could be said of his crown. That golden circlet which rested on his scalp only during ceremony, yet felt like it burrowed into the bone. Inside its band was a thin strip of leather, long since stiffened with oils, sweat, and on more than one occasion blood. Not from battle, from the head itself. From sores that bloomed where the gold rubbed raw. He never allowed it to be cleaned. It weakens the metal, he muttered once, though no smith agreed. The truth, perhaps, is simpler. That crown held his decay like a relic, and to purify, it would be to lie. Sometimes, he did not remove it for days, and so fungus grew. Microscopic, invisible at first, then bolder, clinging in the seams. It fed not only on the leather, but on the king's heat. And by the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The crown had become a living thing. Like a parasite, it claimed dominion over his scalp, nested itself in the folds behind his ears, whispered into his skull. And maybe that's why his decisions grew stranger with time. Maybe it wasn't madness or strategy. Maybe it was infection. A fungal kingdom advising a dying one. But there was still routine. A throne must be sat upon. A court must be addressed. And Edward, for all his rot, performed. Performed with the precision of a marionette carved from stained ivory. His posture was impeccable, but only because it hurt too much to slouch. His robes, always heavy, were soaked through by midday not with rain or spilled wine, but with a royal stew of sweat, lymphatic seepage, and the occasional burst blister. Servants would quietly shift the cushions after he stood, then burn them once the day's performance ended. If they didn't, the stench would awaken the vermin who had learned to sleep in shifts. No one spoke of it. Not the wet ring his body left on polished wood. Not the stains that returned, no matter how many layers were sewn over them. Not the soft squelch his boots made after too many hours standing still. Silence was its own religion in Edward's court, and he was its pope. They kissed his ring not out of reverence, but to delay breathing. And when he spoke, when he finally parted his cracked lips and let the voice escape, it was not the voice of a man. It was older, like something dragged up from beneath the earth, through centuries of dust, regret, and forgotten prayers. His breath could melt wax, literally. Once, a candle sputtered as he leaned too close. It was laughed off, of course. But no one stood that near again. He ate sparingly, but what he did consume turned to salt too quickly. His body was failing its own alchemy. The meat he chewed stringy, overcooked, seared without herbs, went down reluctantly. His throat, ever inflamed, took each swallow as a threat. He drank only ale, because water hurt his teeth. And when he defecated, it was an event. Not because of ceremony, but because of the smell. The guards rotated duties to avoid proximity. The chamber pots were treated like condemned relics. And once, a pot shattered from heat, not from temperature, but from ferment. His body made things no god would claim. And yet, the relics of his rule were passed down with pride. That is the paradox of power, isn't it? We worship the hands that shake, the lips that fester, the thrones with maggots beneath them. Because we are told to. Because legacy does not carry smell. Paper cannot hold stench. And so Edward is remembered in ink, not in air. But here, with me, you remember both. So close your eyes again. Breathe, if you dare. Imagine his fingertips tracing the rim of a goblet, leaving behind not just fingerprints, but a smear of something unclassified oil, pus, maybe remnants of skin. He didn't notice. He rarely noticed. Touch had become numb. His body no longer belonged to him. It was a machine on the verge of collapse, and no amount of heraldry could reverse entropy. He was a man collapsing inwards, cell by cell. But outwardly, still they bowed. And why not? He still commanded armies. He still drew breath. He still glared with the weight of a father betrayed by time. That's all a king needs, isn't it? The ability to look unflinching, even as the teeth behind the smile rot in place. Even as the skin peels beneath the velvet. Even as the ears throb with the constant drone of flies that have grown accustomed to his presence. Even as he dreams of rivers, but wakes to cloth soaked in fluids that no servant wants to name. Edward the Elder ruled longer than most, but not cleaner. He outlasted rivals, but never outran the reek, and perhaps that is the lesson. That some kings do not fall with swords through their bellies, but with their own bodies, turning against them. Slowly, secretly, tragically. Now sleep, if you can. The king is not yet finished with us. He has more to show, and far more to smell. There's a silence that follows kings, one that isn't born of reverence or fear, but of rot. A silence that doesn't hush the crowd, but seeps into walls, into fabric, into marrow. It clings to the air like old breath and lingers after the final word has been spoken, not because it has meaning, but because it has weight. Edward's silence was that kind. A silence so thick it muffled the stink of his body, or perhaps the stink was the silence. It's hard to say, because the two were indistinguishable, just as sweat and soul had long since blurred into a single damp presence that no servant dared confront. And he wore it well, as one might wear a curse that has outlasted the priest who cast it. There is no record of how many hours Edward spent alone, because aloneness is not noteworthy when you're king. It's expected, but not all solitude is equal. Some men are alone because the world forgets them. Edward was alone because the world remembered too clearly. His solitude was not emptiness, it was rejection masked as authority. No one entered his chambers uninvited, and few were ever invited. He didn't speak often, not even to his own reflection, which had grown clouded over time, not because of age, but because the mirror had learned not to look too closely. Silver, like men, tarnishes when touched too often by truth. Behind the doors of his private quarters, time unraveled. Not because he lacked clocks, but because his body no longer obeyed them. Day and night meant little when your eyelids stuck together in sleep and peeled open with crust, so thick it cracked. When your breath fogged the air, even in summer. When your waist no longer came with warning. He soiled himself more than once this, whispered by chambermaids who scrubbed the floor not with soap, but with vinegar and tears. No punishment was ever spoken, only replacement. One servant gone, another arrives. The cycle turned, not because justice was done, but because the stench never left, and the living had to go. He had a chair no one else sat in, not for tradition, but for hygiene. The cushion, permanently indented, wore a ghostly imprint of his body hips wider than imagined, spine curved in a way that hinted at pain rather than pride. The cloth was discolored, the wood chipped, not by use, but by something deeper. Like rot had reached up from the floor and tried to claim the throne. No one replaced it, because no one wanted to touch it. Even upholstery, it seemed, had learned discretion. There was always a bowl of dried herbs nearby. Sage, thyme, crushed mint, not for healing, for masking. The scent did little. It mingled with Edward's own emissions and became something new, something sticky. Visitors left with it on their cloaks. Women reported miscarriages. Clergymen developed coughs that lingered into spring. Physicians tried to name it, but language failed them. And so they called it sacred to avoid calling it sickness. That was the trick of his rule. Turn every affliction into virtue, and no one dares disinfect. But the worst of it, the part no one recorded, was his skin. Not the smell of it, not the texture, the sound, the way it shifted when he moved. The faint, papery rasp of scales brushing against linen. The peel and pull of flesh that had lost all elasticity. Some said they heard it at night, like parchment cracking, like footsteps in dust. No one entered the room to check, not even the guards. Because some noises belong to the body of the king, and some belong to the body the king no longer owns. When he removed his shirt, rare, private, unspeakable, his chest bore lesions like stars. Black specks spreading across pale terrain, each one pulsing slightly, as if still alive. No salve worked. No priest's blessing faded them. They simply grew quieter, deeper, closer to the bone. A personal constellation of decay. He wore amulets, dozens, leather cords, metal trinkets, carved bits of bone, not out of superstition, but desperation. Each one was a gift, an offering, a hope disguised as a charm. He wore them all, around his neck, his wrists, his waist. They clinked when he walked, like chains. A reminder that no man escapes his own superstition, and yet none of them worked. His body still wept. His joints still screamed when he knelt. His genitals had long since become foreign to him, numb some days, burning others. No one knew. He never fathered again. The castle staff developed signals to avoid him. A cough meant clear the hall. A dropped goblet meant reverse course. One candle out in a hallway meant Edward was walking. And when the breeze caught his robes and brought his scent before him, the air itself shuddered. Birds flew differently over his towers. The ivy stopped climbing. Mold spread in neat circles beneath his window, as if mapping something invisible. And still, he reigned. Still, he held court. Still, he signed decrees with fingers that flaked. Still, he shook hands, his nails yellow and soft as wax. Still, he was king. Because England did not yet know how to depose a man for smelling like death. And perhaps it never would. He once held a cousin's newborn, small, warm, delicate. The babe wailed instantly, not out of fear, out of offense. Edward laughed, a dry, croaking sound. "He knows I'm real," he said. No one responded, because the laughter didn't come from joy. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere beneath the skin, where old sorrow festers into bitterness, and then begins to rot, not in silence, but in rhythm. The child grew up. The child told stories. And those stories are why we remember this now. Because nothing dies if it's told honestly. And honesty is what this smells like. Now sleep, if you can, but leave your window open. The wind still carries him. And he's looking for someone who'll inhale him without flinching. It was never the crown that kept him upright. Not the steel spine of duty, not the chainmail of legacy. It was the memory of his father's stare, a glance not of love nor expectation, but of fear. And fear is heavy. He carried it not across battlefields, but down the hallway between his chamber and the privy, each step slower as the years fell off his joints and curled around his feet like ghosts unwilling to go. The stink had grown by then, not in strength, but in authority. It entered rooms before him, asked no permission, demanded no recognition. And yet it received both. It was no longer something to be spoken of in private, nor gagged over in corridors. It was part of the architecture. You could chisel it from the stone, and it would bleed. You could scrape it from the throne, and still find it breathing beneath the polish. It had become the pulse of the palace. And Edward, the man, the myth, the host, was simply the sack of flesh that carried it through the halls. He rarely slept by then. His dreams had betrayed him. There was a time, long forgotten, when he dreamed of peace, of fields stretching green beyond vision, of nakedness without shame, of water that touched the skin and left no wound. But those dreams had dried up like the skin on his thighs, cracked, blistered, gone. Now when he closed his eyes, he heard scratching. Not rats, not wind, something deeper. The sound of his own bones settling into discomfort. The sound of cloth peeling away from a back that had not been aired in weeks. The sound of memory wet and stubborn dragging itself back up through time like a body that refused to stay buried. There is no sleep when you are being watched from inside. And so he wandered, slowly, stiffly, limping not from injury, but from knowledge. The corridors stretched before him like intestines long, coiled, stinking. He walked them not to reach a destination, but because stillness meant confrontation. And there were too many mirrors. Not the kind that showed your face, but the kind that returned your breath cold, short, ragged, as if to remind you that this body, this burden, was still functioning despite its protests. Servants learned to step aside with such precision that he began to doubt they ever existed. Like shadows, they retreated before his gate, disappearing into side doors, ducking behind columns. His approach did not silence the castle, it unmade it. He never touched door handles anymore. Not out of pride, but because the skin on his fingers had thinned so dramatically that even the cold of brass burned. Every contact left the mark his or the doors. It didn't matter. So he let doors remain open. Always. His bedchamber door ajar. His chapel door gaping like a wound. His council hall, yawning wide, so that none could say they weren't warmed. Privacy had long since fled, not because he didn't want it, but because the air inside his rooms turned on itself. It swirled like regret, refusing to settle, picking up every flake of skin he shed and circulating it until the space felt populated with versions of him too small to see. You do not want to be alone when you are surrounded by particles of your own decomposition. Once, he collapsed in the middle of prayer. Not from illness, from exhaustion, from holding his body up against the walls of anatomy. The monks rushed to him, not out of love, but obligation. They tried to lift him, but the fabric of his robe had fused to the sores along his hips. To pull it was to tear him. To leave it was to fail him. And so they stood frozen, hands hovering, eyes twitching toward each other, waiting for someone holier to make the unholy decision. In the end, he rose himself, slowly, trembling, and said nothing, not even thanks. Because nothing in his world was without consequence, especially gratitude. By then, he had forgotten most names, not due to age, but disinterest. People like baths were a temporary solution to a permanent condition. Their roles shifted too quickly. A servant one day, a corpse the next. An ally one morning, a traitor by dusk. He remembered smells instead. The butcher's apprentice who always reeked of mint leaves chewed to mask the blood. The nun whose wool sleeves trapped sweat with biblical dedication. The scribe with breath like fermented apples and fingers, always twitching from ink poisoning. These were the markers he trusted. Names lead, odors did not. And there were so many odors, each one catalogued in some silent index he never shared. The scent of mildew on parchment told him which edict had been forged. The bitter tang of spoiled wax confirmed whether a candle had burned in the name of virtue or vengeance. The metallic whisper on a sword hilt let him know if it had drawn blood that day. He didn't need spies. He sniffed treason like a hound bred for centuries. And when he turned his nose toward a man, it wasn't always to judge his loyalty. It was to determine whether his skin had begun to mimic Edward's own. Decay recognizes its kin. He wore gloves only for ceremony. White, too tight, too clean. They did not fit. They were not meant to. They stretched across knuckles that had long since swollen with arthritis, over fingers warped by time and clawed from constant scratching. The fabric always tore by the second hour, not from movement, from resistance. It resisted him, it recoiled from his flesh. And still he wore them, because ceremony was the only time he could pretend the rot wasn't visible, even if it bled through. And then there were the nights, the long, slow ones, when the moonlight turned everything pale enough to resemble bone. Those nights he sat by the fire, not for warmth, but because flame was the only thing he still trusted. Fire, after all, has no politics. It does not flatter. It consumes. And he admired that. Sometimes he held his hand too close to the flame, just to feel something real, just to test whether his nerves still functioned. They did, but only just. The pain was a whisper, distant, like an old friend you no longer recognize, but can't quite forget. He once placed a letter into the hearth without reading it. No one knows why. Some say it was from Rome. Others say it bore his son's seal. But whatever it was, he never let it enter him. He burned it with the same expression he wore in battle blank, focused, strangely calm. Because he understood, more than most, that some things are too heavy to carry in the mind. And if the hands must bear them, let the hands burn. His physicians died younger than expected. Each one lasted less than a year. Not from plague, from dread. One threw himself into a river. One drank lye. One vanished without farewell. No investigation followed. Because no one wanted to ask what it meant to touch a man unhealed for decades. To smell him up close. To examine his gums and realize they bled without contact. To watch teeth fall into the basin during conversation. to feel the rattle of his chest and know it was not a cough, but something nesting. No one wanted that truth, especially not written in ink. And still, the kingdom thrived. Isn't that the cruel miracle? That while the king softened into collapse, the markets stayed open. The bells rang. The peasants planted. The clerics preached. Life did not pause for his putrefaction. It marched alongside it, pretending not to notice the droppings of flesh along the parade route. And perhaps that's why the people loved him, even feared him. Because if Edward could rot and still rule, then perhaps they could rot and still live. Now sleep, if you can. The air grows thick again. He's closer than you think. And the wind remembers. He did not die suddenly. That would have been mercy. No, Edward unraveled slowly, daily, inch by inch, like a scroll written in flesh, being read aloud by time itself, and time was not a kind narrator. His body gave no final declaration, no dramatic collapse at a feast or fatal wound on the battlefield. Instead, it deteriorated the way old bread does, quietly, with mold beginning at the edges, spreading inward until the center no longer remembers being whole. They said he was resting more in his final weeks, but they lied. He wasn't resting. He was being consumed. From within, from without, from every crevice the court dared not mention. Even his sighs began to smell like sap leaking from a tree that no longer grows, like iron and wet wool and something deeply wrong that had forgotten its name. No one dared pronounce him ill. Kings do not fall sick. They fall silent. And Edward had already been doing that for years. What was one more hour with his mouth shut? One more day of avoiding mirrors. The difference was that now, the silence began to stink differently. It wasn't just sweat anymore. It wasn't even infection. It was rot with intent. A rot that had learned his name. A rot that had waited patiently beneath the throne, beneath the skin, beneath the doctrine, waiting for the moment the crown could no longer distract the flesh from surrendering. He stayed in bed, but the bed was not soft. It had hardened, as beds do when a body spends more time melting than moving. The sheets, once white, now told stories in shades of yellow and rust. They were changed less frequently, now not because of neglect, but because the staff had discovered something unspeakable. The smell worsened when disturbed. The fabric trapped it. Moving it released it. And so they let the linen sit, like bandages over a wound they had long since stopped trying to heal. His pillows grew thinner from one side, the side he could still turn his head toward, and thicker with dread on the other. No one touched the untouched side. There were things nesting in the stuffing. He coughed without sound, bled without pain, passed time without pulse. His breath came in wet intervals, punctuated by the sound of his chest arguing with itself. No one wept at his bedside. Tears required clarity, and what lingered in that room was a fog of denial, so thick it erased lineage. Even his sons didn't recognize the man in the bed. Or perhaps they did, and chose not to. Because what kind of air wishes to inherit that smell? They burned candles day and night. Beeswax, sandalwood, frankincense stolen from the chapel. The scent mingled with the royal decomposition and created something new, something ceremonial, priestly, sickening. One bishop vomited after blessing the room. No one replaced him. The next clergyman stood at the threshold and offered his prayers from there. God, it seemed, didn't need to step inside. The flies were brave. They came and went freely. They did not wait for death to feast. They settled on his lips as he murmured final orders, crawled across his lids when he blinked too slowly. One entered his ear and stayed. It never came out. They sealed that ear after he died, not to honor him, but to contain it. And still, they wrote hymns. They composed ballads. They gilded manuscripts with his name, adorned with symbols of eternal rule. But eternity, as it turns out, smells like meat left in the sun. When the body finally stopped twitching, No one noticed for several minutes. His stillness had been rehearsed. His eyes had long since turned from sight to reflection pools that did not shimmer, only absorbed. It was the silence that gave him away. Not the absence of breath, but the absence of struggle. A moment when even the mold in the stone stopped growing to listen. When even the breeze outside the window forgot how to move. They covered his face, not with reverence, but as a favor to the next who entered. The cloth touched his skin and did not rise again. It stuck. His face, even in death, was adhesive. The ritual of death began. Not the grief, no. That would come much later, in the quiet places. First came the task of rendering him into legacy. Of making this sack of stink and sorrow into something worth worshipping. They stripped the bed and burned it. Not for honor. For hygiene. The frame crackled black and hissed with a dampness no water could explain. The floor beneath was stained in the shape of his spine. His clothes were not buried with him. They were not preserved. They were not even washed. They were destroyed. And not just burned. Boiled, crushed, scraped, until the memory of thread was gone. The ashes smelled sweet. A monk fainted. His body was prepared for burial by men who would never speak again. They did not take vows of silence. Their throats simply stopped working. One lost his sense of taste. Another, his hearing. The last bled from the fingertips for 3 days. No explanation was ever given. Some believed the rot had finally learned how to defend itself. And so they placed him in a box lined with lead and prayers. The prayers were not to guide him to heaven. They were to seal what he left behind. They placed herbs beneath his tongue, not for symbolism, but for containment. And still, the box trembled, not from movement, from pressure, from the weight of unspent decay begging to be free. They carried him through the halls like a relic. The same halls he had once paced in silence now echoed with footsteps that did not dare pause. The procession moved quickly, too quickly, as if they feared he might change his mind, as if they feared he might rise. Not as king, but as consequence. No commoners were allowed to see the body. That was the official statement. The truth was simpler. They were afraid someone might recognize him not from portraits, but from smell. Because memory, when linked to the senses, never fades. And there were villagers who remembered the wind changing direction the day he passed through their hamlet. There were farmers whose dogs howled when he spoke. There were children who screamed not at his face, but at his shadow. They would have known. And what king survives recognition? The tomb was sealed in haste. Not with stone, but with salt, barrels of it, poured along the edges. The masons wore gloves soaked in vinegar and blessed by 4 different priests. They did not speak as they laid the slabs, not out of ritual, but out of necessity. Speech required breathing. And the tomb had begun to sigh. Years passed. The flowers left in his name wilted within hours. Stone statues placed above his resting place cracked without impact. Mice avoided the crypt. Forms curled backward when the soil grew warm. And the air developed a taste. Visitors to the cathedral described it differently. Metallic, some said. Like spoiled honey, said another. But the most honest simply said, it smelled like someone who wanted to be remembered too badly. And now, here you are, listening, breathing, remembering. Because Edward is not a name on a page. He is a taste at the back of your throat. He is a weight in the air when the windows won't open. He is the reason your candle flickers when no one has passed by. He did not die. He fermented. And we are all still inhaling him. Now sleep, if you can, but know this, rot never rests. It only waits. The king was buried, but not gone. They said he was sealed beneath stone, tucked beneath layers of salt and prayer, walled behind the language of legacy. But language cracks faster than marble, and Edward never truly belonged to silence. He had lived too long in the mouths of others, in their breath, in the pauses between their sentences. He had dripped from their sleeves and soaked into their dreams. Death was never going to be enough to stop him. Not when his scent had already colonized the kingdom. The room where he died was never used again. That wasn't official. No one declared it cursed, but slowly purpose peeled away. The windows were shuttered permanently. The hearth never relit. The chairs grew dust not from time, but from refusal. Even the flies stopped entering. The door swelled from moisture and superstition until it no longer opened, not because of locks or keys, but because no one wanted to touch it. And in that room, the ghost of his skin turned sour. The walls wept. They bled salt. They forgot how to hold sound. And when storms passed, the lightning never struck the tower above it, because even the sky had learned to divert its attention. But Edward had already escaped that room. He had learned to live in absence, in hollow things, in empty corridors where no torch held flame for long. He curled into the belly of scrolls written with his name, warped the ink, soured the vellum. He hid in the scenes of robes passed down to descendants who never questioned why they always smelled slightly wrong. He nested in the crests carved into doors, in the dust that formed behind statues meant to honor him. No statue of Edward has ever stayed clean. The dust grows back too fast. The birds do not perch on them. The moss climbs faster up his feet than any other king. It's not memory, it's possession. They tried to erase him gently, with time, with cleaner language, with lineage, but rot laughs at pedigree. His blood survived, yes, but so did something else, something not born, but shed. A layer of being that had long since separated from flesh, but refused to stop feeding. Call it essence, call it curse. But even now, the walls remember. His descendants spoke his name in whispers, not from fear, from shame. They inherited a kingdom, but not the right to smell like it. His eldest tried to rebuild the church he once stood in. It collapsed 3 days after completion. No casualties. Only the altar crushed beneath its own ambition. The workers described a pressure in the air before it fell like a breath being held too long. Like lungs denying oxygen in protest, the youngest son went mad at 30, not quickly, not theatrically. He simply stopped blinking. One day, he stared too long into the garden and never turned away. They fed him broth and buried him standing up. His final words, "He's not under the floor." No one asked who. They already knew. A bishop once said that Edward had become a lesson. But lessons end. Edward didn't. He spilled. He continued. Into coins that smelled of mildew. Into stones that refused to dry. Into whispers passed between guards who never met him, but described the same dreams. A figure wrapped in wet cloth, standing at the edge of their vision, never approaching, but never retreating either. One guard tore out his own tongue. They said it was mental strain. But his room smelled like boiled meat for days after, and no one ever entered again. Even the birds changed. Crows came in threes. Always in threes. They nested on rooftops above court chambers, stared downward, never called out. One day, they vanished. Not flew, vanished. The guards on duty resigned that evening, not for fear, for instinct, and still, tourists visit. They see the tapestries, the scrolls, the crown replica sealed behind glass. They do not ask why it fogs up without cause. They take pictures in front of the tomb that's not quite centered in the chapel. They do not ask why the floor was shifted 3 inches to the left during reconstruction. The architects say it was for symmetry. But symmetry never favors the dead. They buy souvenirs. They write blog posts. They light candles without scent. The guides never speak of the air. But some visitors do. They write about a pressure in their chests. A headache that lifts only after they leave. A metallic taste that follows them home and fades in 4 days. Always 4, not 3. Not 5. 4. Children cry near the entrance. Dogs refuse to cross the threshold. The bells chime off key on anniversaries. And no one ever lights a candle that stays lit for more than 90 minutes. That's the longest. 90. After that, the wick curls inward. As if it knows better, Edward's name lives in records. But he lives elsewhere. In the low hum before thunder. In the rot that forms between bricks that weren't there yesterday. In the hollow space behind curtains drawn in sunlight. He lives in the air, and you've already breathed him. You did the moment you started listening. Now sleep, if you can. He's not done leaking. The stone remembers. Not the man, not the weight of his words, nor the exact cadence of his steps, but the residue. What seeps after ceremony? What clings after flesh is gone? The stone doesn't revere, it absorbs. And what it absorbed from Edward was not memory, it was saturation. The corners of the chapel where he was crowned have never dried, not even in drought. Priests walk past them faster now, muttering Latin under their breath like moths folding wings. They won't kneel there, not because of heresy, because of moisture, and what lives inside it. Because water, left too long in dark places, begins to dream. And those dreams remember the king better than Scripture ever did. The cathedral floor creaks in places it shouldn't. Not from wood, there's none. Only flagstone. Ancient, deliberate, heavy. But still, it shifts, sighs, groans as though something below it is still restless. Something not content with being sealed. Something not content with being named. Because once you are named, you are categorized. And Edward, he resisted categorization the way rot resists light. Every time they tried to define him a reformer, a conqueror, a father of England, he oozed sideways, staining the margins of the parchment, blurring the clarity of lineage. The crypt beneath the cathedral was reinforced 3 times, not for collapse, for silence. Each time they thought they had sealed it, something whispered. Low, not words, pressure. Hums behind the teeth of masons who had never known. Fear until their hammers struck too close to where the air changed. One quit halfway. Another began to speak in reverse. The third simply forgot his daughter's name and never remembered it again. Stone doesn't forget. Flesh does. But the kingdom did not stop. It built upward. It paved over. It planted new seeds, raised new children, painted Edward into stained glass with cleaner cheeks and sanitized eyes. They made him thinner. They made him kinder. They made him smell like incense and legitimacy. But glass cracks. And in winter, when the frost creeps in and breath fogs the nave, his face on the window sometimes appears wet. Not with dew, with sweat. The condensation doesn't match the rest of the glass. The other saints stay dry. Only Edward weeps. And only on anniversaries no one celebrates anymore. There's a library that houses the last letter he ever touched. They don't display it. Not because it's fragile, but because it stinks. Still, centuries later, through glass, through lacquer, through the meticulous efforts of archivists who wore gloves, masks, holy water on the wrists. The letter says nothing important. A decree about grain storage. But the ink is smudged with something oily, something biological. A smear where a finger once rested too long, as though even in writing policy, the body could not help but mark its protest. The archivist who cataloged it never came back to work. He didn't quit. He didn't die. He simply stopped opening his eyes. His wife says he's still breathing, but only when the house is silent. They don't keep candles anymore. Edward's rot has outlived his bones. Not physically, his tomb remains undisturbed, if only by law, but spiritually. His decay metastasized into rumor, into ritual, into dust on shelves no one wants to clean, into a draft that slinks beneath doorways, even when all windows are shut. A historian once tried to write a comprehensive biography. She lasted until chapter 3. Then she mailed back her advance with a note. He's not done talking. It's easy to dismiss that kind of madness as romanticism, but the pages she wrote smelled strange. Like old blood. Like mildewed books left in the mouth of a cave. Her cat refused to enter the study again. Her plants turned yellow. Her fingernails cracked until they bled and never healed. And when asked what she meant, she said only, "His name keeps moving." Because it does. Try to say it. Out loud. Edward. And you'll feel the back of your throat tighten. You'll swallow. Not because you're thirsty, but because something wants to crawl out instead. He lingers in syllables. Not like a curse, but like a presence watching the shape of your mouth, trying to remember what it once meant to speak. Because his words weren't clean. They weren't declarations. They were exhalations pulled from lungs lined with forgotten responsibility, punctuated by coughs no healer could interpret. And what does it mean to be remembered like that? Not for your battles, not for your lineage, but for your decay, for the way your skin colored the air, for how your breath altered the pH of a chamber's atmosphere. That's a kind of immortality history books aren't built to carry, but rooms are, and so are we. Because every time we mention him, we open something. Not a book, not a door. Something closer. Something rib-caged and involuntary. Something warm and sick and inherited. Something that smells like regret preserved in oak. Because Edward was never just a king. He was a reminder that even power decomposes. And when it does, it becomes contagious. He is the reason some corridors still feel colder than others. The reason some ink won't dry. A reason some mirrors cloud before dawn. He is not a haunting. He is a humidity. He is in the fibers. The fibers of stone, of fabric, of history, of us. And still he waits. Not to return, but to be finished. To be digested. To finally be exhaled completely from the lungs of a world that's been holding its breath for far too long. But you won't finish him tonight. You've only just begun to let him in. Now sleep, if you can. You're breathing slower now. That's how he knows he's winning. And now, you feel it, don't you? That itch just beneath the skin. Not pain. Not even discomfort. Just presence. Like something too old to have a name brushing softly against the inside of your ribs. That's where he ends up, you see. Not in tombs, not in bloodlines, not in dusty Latin footnotes. He ends up here. In you. In the damp crease between shoulder and spine. In the stale exhale before sleep. Edward is no longer a man. He's no longer even a memory. He's what happens when memory festers and refuses to leave. He's what happens when reverence dies, but the body doesn't. The earth above his tomb is greener than it should be. Rich, dark, unwilling to dry. They tried to plant lavender there once. It withered. Then thistles grew aggressively, without seed, without pattern. The thorns curled inward, as if protecting something that didn't want to rise again, but needed to breathe. Soil has lungs, you know. And some graves continue to inhale long after they've been closed. His name is still taught, but only in certain rooms. Bright rooms, sanitized rooms. Rooms with air conditioning and digital projectors. Rooms where the words come too quickly, and no one pauses after saying the elder, because pausing gives him time. Time to crawl back in, to reclaim the space he lost between syllables. So they rush. So they skim, so they move on. But names don't forget how they were spoken. They curl into wallpaper, nest behind linings of suit jackets worn by historians, too proud to acknowledge the cold spot behind their podiums. The silence in archives is no longer about respect. It's about containment. When students ask why the section on Edward smells musty, the guides say the papers are old. When asked why the pages are slightly damp in summer, even when the air is dry, they mention poor insulation. But they don't touch the books. Not without gloves. Not without muttering a date under their breath before opening them. A date not written anywhere. A date only heard in dreams. Some have tried to unbind him, to write the truth cleanly, to strip away the myth and place his decay in context. They fail, not because of politics, but because the ink turns, literally. Sentences blur after midnight. Paragraphs slide down the page, margins swell, pages yellow in real time. One scholar found maggots between chapters. Not dead ones, moving, chewing through footnotes that dared call Edward ordinary. He was never ordinary. He was the exact opposite. He was the reminder that kingship was never about majesty. It was about skin, about the weight of being watched and the cost of refusing to cleanse. His crown was not heavy with gold. It was heavy with all the things no one else would carry: pity, lust, pus, inheritance. The crown didn't rest on his head. It absorbed. Every bead of sweat, every thought he refused to say aloud, every lie his advisors choked back. That's why the gold darkened. That's why it still smells like iron. Gold doesn't rust, but grief does. And his grief was viral. It spread into treaties, into pews, into the backs of soldiers' throats as they choked on his commands, into women who bore sons that looked like him even when they weren't his, into children who cried when they walked past the wrong portrait, into horses that refused to be saddled on foggy mornings, into the sound the fire made when no one else was awake. It spread, quietly, diligently, without hope of cure. And we caught it. Not because we wanted to, because history is not inherited. It's inhaled, in coughs, in rumors, in the way a room changes temperature when the truth gets too close. That's how Edward survives, not in grandeur, but in gut. In that tightness just before understanding. In the dread that tastes like metal. In the word King said without blinking. He survives in you. Because you listened too long. Because your ears are now lined with wax thicker than memory. Because your skin has started to itch. Because you cannot unhear what your ancestors ignored. Because you know, deep down, you will dream of him. And the dream will not be heroic. It will be damp. It will stink. And it will linger. Now sleep, if you can. But do not expect to wake up alone. You stayed, didn't you? Through the moaning pages, through the stench and soft weeping of a king, decomposing in his own timeline, through every breath of mildew and metal, you stayed, not because you trusted me, but because you couldn't stop, because the part of you that once winced now leans forward. That part, quiet, stubborn, unblinking, is the one he wanted from the start. Edward never needed armies. He needed ears. And now that he has yours, there is no going back. You don't walk away from a corpse that's already under your skin. There is a peculiar thing that happens when a man dies, and the world keeps saying his name. The body decays, the titles remain, and slowly, something grotesque begins to take root, not a legacy, but a fermentation. Edward the Elder was not embalmed in glory, not sealed in reverence. He was packed in myth like meat in salt rubbed in stories, until the flesh stopped screaming. But salt doesn't cleanse. It preserves. And what it preserves is not always what we intended. They meant to honor him. Instead, they locked him in. And we've been breathing the brine ever since. History, when it spoils, doesn't turn black. It turns soft. Like fruit left on the windowsill. Like minds left too long in echo chambers. Like skin that forgot what sun used to feel like. Edward is soft now, malleable, dripping into curriculum slides and museum plaques, his face cleaned up just enough to fit next to a bullet point. The rot is beneath, always beneath. If you scratch hard enough, you'll find it. In the language. In the silence between dates. In the fact that no one mentions how he smelled at the end. You have to ask. And when you do, the answers don't come from books. They come from the way archivists pause. From the way their hands twitch before turning the page. From the way your stomach twists before they say a word. We don't to tell the truth about kings, because we're afraid it will make us less human. But what if it makes us more? What if dignity was never clean? What if royalty was always a performance for the living, and the dead had already moved on to something more honest? Edward's honesty was not in his policies, not in his reforms, not in the sons who carved out pieces of England with his blood still warm on their lips. His honesty came later, after, in the way his decay refused to stay underground, in the way his scent outlived his voice, in the way no one could name what grew on the walls of his tomb, but everyone agreed it wasn't to mold. We build statues to forget. We light candles to distract. But the real monument to Edward is not carved in stone. It's the discomfort you feel when you walk past history too quickly. That flinch, that second glance, that whisper of mildew on a book spine no one touched since 1894. That's him. Not watching, seeping. And what are you, now that you know? You're not innocent. You're not clean. You've inhaled the truth. Not the facts. Those were easy. Those were digestible. No, what you swallowed was much older, much thicker. The kind of truth that sticks to your ribs and lingers behind your eyes. You might try to forget. You'll fail. You'll hear his name in unrelated places. Edward. And you'll freeze for half a second longer than you should. You'll taste copper. You'll look for the source of the smell and find nothing. But something inside you will shift. Just a little. Just enough. Because that's what this has always been about. Not remembering. Becoming. Edward doesn't live on because he was great. He lives on because he rotted loudly. Because he reminded the world that no crown is immune to skin. That every throne eventually creaks under the weight of its occupant's sweat. That no matter how many scribes rewrite the ending, the body always knows how it really died, and he died wet. Not in battle, not in glory, but in damp linens and swollen limbs, and the quiet panic of a man whose body betrayed him long before his enemies did. He died aware. Aware that his breath was heavier than the prayers spoken over him. Aware that no kingdom could absolve the smell. Aware that someday, someone like you would sit in the dark, listening to the sound of his legacy dripping between the words, and he smiled, not because he was proud, but because he knew that decay was the only empire that never fell. You want a conclusion, something to wrap this all in silk and send it off like a proper eulogy. But Edward doesn't do silk. He does mildew. He does rust. He does that thin film on standing water that looks still until you touch it and watch it ripple into places you can't see. He's not done with you. You don't get to walk away untouched. You're already different. You already flinch at shadows shaped like crowns. You already sniff the air twice when no one else seems to notice. You already carry him. And perhaps you always did, because maybe kings like Edward are not made. Maybe they are revealed, in quiet moments, in the still rot beneath civilization, in the mold that grows between pages no one opens anymore. Maybe Edward isn't the exception. Maybe he's the blueprint. Maybe every power, no matter how golden its birth, ends here, in wet sheets, in muttered regrets, in slow-blooming sores in servants who stop meeting your eyes, in a name that no longer feels like yours when whispered aloud. So don't whisper it. Not tonight. Let the air cool. Let your breath slow. But keep your eyes open just a little longer. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that rot moves faster in the dark. And Edward is still very, very damp. Sleep well. If you still dare.